They were 20 years old when the clan decided they had to go. Not with a hearing. Not with a warning fire or a council drum or any of the rituals the Ashvale clan used when it wanted to pretend its decisions were fair. Just a morning in the dead of winter when their Uncle Durg appeared at the door with 2 packs already loaded, his tusks set forward the way they went when he had made up his mind about something and did not want to hear argument. The whole street was watching from behind frost-glazed shutters. Zira Vale looked at those shutters and understood something that would take years to stop hurting. Being right had always been the most dangerous thing about her. She had been grinding dried maize corn at the kitchen table when she heard the knock. It was not really a knock. It was a fist against the door. 3 heavy blows, deliberate and final. She knew the weight of her uncle's fist. She had known it since she was 7 years old, and their mother was 3 months in the ground. Kova was still asleep, or pretending to be. That was one of the differences between them that nobody except Zira ever noticed. Kova could go still as deep water when she sensed trouble gathering, folding herself into silence while the storm built. Zira tended to walk straight into it with her eyes open and her jaw set. They were identical in every feature that could be seen. The same lime-green skin, pale as split citrus in the winter light, the same dark hair worn long and loose, the same angular jaw and wide amber eyes that their mother had called her best mistake. In most things that couldn't be seen, they were mirror opposites. Zira set down the grinding stone and wiped her hands on her skirt. She opened the door. Durg Vale stood on the frozen step with 2 packs at his feet and 4 inches of new snow on the brim of his iron-forged helm. He was a large orc, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had been weathered past the point of reading. He had not always been unkind. She remembered from very early childhood a version of him that had laughed at the supper table and called her mother by a nickname too soft to repeat now. That version had stopped existing around the time he took responsibility for 2 small girls the clan had already started whispering about. "Winter's bad," he said. He was not looking at her face. He was looking somewhere to the left of her ear, worse than any I've seen in 30 years. "There isn't enough in the stores for everyone." Zira said nothing. The clan council met last night. Still not her face. 3 families have already lost young ones to the cold. There's talk the bone fever is coming up from the lowlands. "I know," she said. "I told Elder Grot 2 weeks ago that the grain stores had been miscounted. I showed him the ledger." Dur's jaw tightened. "Clans don't like being shown ledgers, Zira. Clans are going to be hungry whether they like the ledger or not." "That," he stopped himself. Breathed, "that is exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about." He looked at the packs then, made himself look at them. She understood, watching his face, that this was not easy for him, and that it was also not difficult enough. "I packed what I could spare," he said. "Seeds from the fall stores. A field knife. 2 wool blankets. The small axe. Enough dried meat for 5 days if you're careful. And if we're not careful? Then 3. She stared at him for a long moment. 20 years old in a doorway in the worst winter in living memory with the whole street watching. She thought about saying something real. Something that would crack through whatever he had built around himself to be able to stand on that step and do this. She thought about asking him if he remembered her mother's face, if he remembered the promise he made at the burial. She didn't ask either of those things. "Let me wake Kova," she said, and went back inside. Kova was not asleep. She was sitting on the edge of the sleeping mat with her boots already laced and her coat across her lap, her dark eyes steady in the gray light coming through the ice-filmed window. She had heard every word. "How far?" she said. "Far enough that we don't come back." Kova looked down at the coat in her hands. For a moment, just a moment, her face did something complicated. Then she stood up and put the coat on. That was the thing about Kova that Zira loved most and found most maddening. She made decisions completely, and then she kept them. No second guessing. No looking backward. Once she moved, she had already moved. If you're watching this from wherever you are right now, drop your city in the comments below. Hit like and follow, because this story is one you need to see to the end. They came out together. They always came out together. Durg was still standing on the step. The four neighbors who had arranged themselves on the street had not moved either. Old Merritt with her arms crossed over her chest, the Gruel brothers standing side by side like a matched pair of warped fence posts, and Ancient Breck leaning on his walking stick with an expression that was almost pity and mostly relief. These were orcs who had eaten grain that Zira helped mill, who had taken her recommendations about crop rotation and then quietly credited the improvement to weather, who had brought their sick animals to Kova in the dark hours when no one was watching. Zira picked up one of the packs. It was heavier than she expected. Whatever else Durg was, he had packed it properly. Kova picked up the other. They did not say goodbye. There was not, at that moment, a goodbye in either of them. Kova looked at the four neighbors on the street the way you look at a fence line you have already decided to go around. And Zira looked at her uncle's face one last time. That worn, exhausted, somewhere to the left of honest face, and filed away the expression she found there. Not for revenge, because she wanted to remember exactly what it looked like when someone chose convenience over the thing they were supposed to be. Then they turned north into the mountain, into the white. The storm hit them before they'd cleared the tree line. It had been building since before dawn, that particular quality of stillness that precedes a real blizzard, when the ravens stop calling and the air goes tight. Zira had noticed it at first light and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say. The storm was coming regardless. They were going into it regardless. The trail north out of Ashvale Hollow ran along a creek bed for the first 2 miles before climbing sharply into the upper timber. In 2 feet of accumulated snow with fresh powder driving sideways out of the northwest, it was a series of guesses and corrections. Kova led. She had always had a slightly better instinct for terrain, some quality of attention that Zira privately thought of as Kova reading the ground the way other orcs read faces. She moved without hesitation, even when hesitation would have been reasonable, and Zira followed in her tracks and tried to think. She had a map. Technically, it was not her map. It had been among their mother's papers, a hand-drawn geological survey of the upper mountain range done by a geomancer named Calder Voss, who had been contracted by a mining concern out of the Eastern Territories and found nothing worth extracting. The map had ended up folded into the back of one of her mother's agricultural notebooks. Zira had read it approximately 40 times. The map showed, among other geological features, a series of ravines in the upper northwest quadrant of the mountain range. One of them, marked with a notation she had puzzled over for years, was labeled Warm Stone Formation, Limestone, Possible Deep Earth Heat. Calder Voss had been looking for ore. He had not been interested in warmth. But Zira had spent 2 years thinking about what that notation might mean in practical terms, storing it in the back of her mind like provisions for a journey she hadn't known she'd be taking. She was taking it now. Northeast, she said over the wind, after the second ridge. Kova didn't slow down. You're sure? I'm sure of the notation. I'm not sure of the translation. That's honest. Also not very comforting. No, Kova agreed. Keep up. They walked for 6 hours. The storm thickened as they climbed, the temperature dropping in a way that felt less like weather and more like a decision the mountain had made. Zira lost feeling in her left hand around the 3rd hour and spent the next mile flexing it inside her mitten until sensation came back, painful and bright. They talked sometimes, not constantly. Do you remember when Papa's elk got into the seed shed? Kova said during one of the longer flat stretches. You let it in, Zira said. I didn't let it in on purpose. I was 7. You were 7, and you wanted to see if elk liked fermented grain. They do, incidentally. They like it a great deal. I know. I was there for the aftermath. Kova laughed, a short sound, more breath than voice, swallowed almost immediately by the wind. Papa made that face with his brow tusks. He had very expressive brow tusks for someone who didn't talk much. And Mama laughed until she cried. She tried to hide it. She was terrible at hiding it. The silence after that had a different texture. Zira let it sit. I've been thinking, Kova said after a while, about the fact that neither of us cried back there. Would it have changed anything? No, but it might have made us look less frightening. I was going to say unaffected. Those might be the same thing to some orcs. A pause. I keep trying to figure out which one I am. Angry or sad. I can't find the line between them right now. Zira thought about her uncle's face on the step, the way he'd looked at the air beside her ear instead of her eyes. The way the packs had already been loaded when he arrived, which meant he'd packed them the night before, which meant he'd spent a night in the same house knowing what morning would bring. Both, she said. I think it's both at the same time. That's the part no one ever tells you about. The second ridge was worse than the first. By the time they came down the far slope, the light had gone flat and gray, maybe 2 hours before dark, and both of them were moving with the deliberate, careful pace that comes from real exhaustion. Not the theatrical kind, but the working kind that knows it has to continue regardless. Zira pulled the map from inside her coat. Her fingers were clumsy with cold, but she could read it. Left, she said. Down through those ironwood. There should be a creek runoff. Kova stopped and looked at the trees. They were old growth, enormous and dark-barked, their lower branches buried under 5 feet of drifted snow so that they rose from the white like columns in some abandoned ruin. Between them, the ground dropped sharply. How sure are you? More than I was an hour ago. That rock face. She pointed to an exposed granite shelf 20 yards to the right. Matches what Voss drew on the survey. He was here. We're in the right place. But the ravine itself, I won't know until we're in it. Kova studied the ironwood for 3 seconds. Then we go in, she said. They almost missed it. The ravine entrance was not what Zira had pictured. Not a dramatic opening in the earth, not a visible cleft in the rock. It was a narrow slot between 2 limestone faces half buried in snow, easy to walk past if you weren't looking for it specifically. Kova spotted it because the snow in front of the slot was not settling in the same way as the snow around it. It was slightly less deep. Something beneath was affecting it. Heat, Kova said. Zira felt the word go through her like a match struck in a dark room. They pushed through the slot sideways, packs scraping stone, and the ravine opened around them. Not huge, maybe 40 feet wide at its broadest, with limestone walls rising 30 feet on either side and a floor of compressed earth and old leaf matter that hadn't seen heavy snowfall. The snow that had entered was thin, patchy, and the air was different. Not warm, exactly, not the warmth of a hearth fire. But the cold was reduced, modulated, like the difference between standing in a river and standing in a spring-fed pool. The walls held something. The earth below was doing something. Zira dropped to one knee and pressed her bare palm flat against the ground. She had pulled the mitten off before she even thought about it. The earth was not cold. She looked up at Kova, and Kova was already looking at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because what was happening was large enough that words felt premature. You didn't narrate a miracle in progress. You made sure it was real first. Walk the perimeter, Zira said. They walked it, both of them, separately, touching the walls, pressing palms to the stone, paying attention. The heat effect was strongest toward the northern end of the ravine, where the limestone went deeper and the rock face had a faint mineral smell, sharp and clean. There was a natural shelf of stone along the west wall that would catch warmth from below and face away from the prevailing wind. There was a depression in the earth near the northern end, where last summer's vegetation, dead now but dense and matted, told her the growing season here extended beyond what it should at this elevation. And there was, tucked deep in the northern alcove where the limestone curved inward on itself, the mouth of a larger cave, barely visible. Zira had to put her face close to the wall to see it properly. She reached back and grabbed Kova's sleeve without looking. "Here," she said. Kova leaned past her and looked into the dark. "How far back does it go?" "I don't know yet." They looked at each other. "We'll need fire to see," Kova said. "And if we make fire in there, we'll know very quickly whether the ventilation is adequate." Kova straightened up. In that moment, Zira watched her face do its characteristic thing, moving through the options, the risks, the calculations, without any of it showing much on the surface. Just the slight tension around her eyes that Zira had learned to read over 20 years. "Strike the fire," Kova said. "I'll watch the smoke." The flint and steel were at the bottom of Zira's pack. She built a small starter from the dry undersides of the leaf matter on the cave floor. There was dry matter down there, preserved by the warmth coming up through the rock. And after 3 strikes, she had a flame. She held it up and watched the smoke. The smoke moved away from them, slowly, deliberately, drawn toward the back of the cave. "Ventilation," she said. "Natural," Kova said from behind her. "The warm air circulating. There must be a secondary outlet further in." They stood in the mouth of the cave with the small fire guttering between them, and the cave went back further than the firelight could reach. Maybe 60 feet, maybe more. The ceiling was high enough to stand upright. The floor was rough, but walkable. The walls were dry. And from somewhere ahead, from somewhere in the rock's own deep gut, came the faint, steady warmth that had been there all along. Kova said, very quietly, "We're going to live." It wasn't a question. It wasn't quite a statement either. It was the kind of thing you say when you have held your certainty in reserve for hours because you couldn't afford to be wrong about it, and now you have just enough evidence to let yourself believe. Zira said nothing. She added a piece of dry wood to the fire and let it grow. Outside, above and behind them, the blizzard was eating the world. Snow was burying the path they'd walked, the hollow they'd left, the faces of the orcs who had watched them go. The mountain was indifferent to all of it, warm in its own hidden places, going about its ancient business. Inside the cave, the fire caught and held. The first 48 hours were practical in the way that emergencies tend to be practical. 2 wool blankets. 5 days of dried meat, 3 if they weren't careful, and they were going to be careful. 1 field knife. 1 small axe. A length of rope. A tin cup. A fire kit. The geological map. Their mother's agricultural notebook. And the seeds. The seeds were the thing. Durr had said seeds from the fall stores, and he had not been careless about it. There were packets of winter rye, turnip, and squash, and 1 small paper twist of something that turned out to be an early variety of cave moss that their mother had experimented with years ago, trying to see if it could be cultivated indoors. Zira held that last packet for a long time. She didn't know if her uncle had included it deliberately or by accident. She decided it didn't matter. "Rye first," Kova said. "If the soil here responds at all to the deep earth heat, rye has the best germination tolerance for cold adjacent conditions." "I know. I wasn't second-guessing you. I was thinking out loud. They sound the same. Only to you." Kova took the rye packet and turned it in her hands. "The depression at the north end, that's where we try first." "Agreed. But the soil needs amendment. Clay heavy. Limestone particulate from the walls and organic matter from the ravine floor, alkaline balance." Kova looked at her. "You've been planning this since we left. I've been planning this since I was 16 and read Voss's survey for the 4th time. You didn't tell me. Zira had thought about this. I was afraid you'd talk me out of believing it was real. Kova was quiet for a moment. Then, I wouldn't have. I know that now. Constructing shelter inside the cave took 4 days. They were not builders. Zira said so directly. We're not trying to build, Kova said, fitting a crossbrace between 2 upright stakes with a length of rope cut to thirds. We're trying to make a structure that doesn't fall on us while we sleep. Those are different goals. The left wall is 2 inches out of plumb. Then we'll lean everything right. Stop watching me and start on the roof. The roof was branches laid dense and overlapping, weighted with stones. It would not have impressed anyone who had studied construction. It kept the wind off their sleeping place and held the warmth from the fire below it. That was what it needed to do. The first night, Zira lay on her back on a mat of compacted leaf matter and stared at the underside of the rough ceiling and felt something she had to turn over several times to identify. It was satisfaction, not happiness. Happiness was a different animal, and she was not going to claim it in the 2nd week of their exile, in a cave with 5 days of dried meat between them. But satisfaction was the feeling of having used herself correctly, of having brought her full capacity to bear on a real problem and found that the capacity was sufficient, perhaps the only feeling that could honestly coexist with terrible circumstances, because it did not require the circumstances to be good. It only required that you had done something real with them. She turned her head and looked at Kova, already asleep, breathing slow and even, one hand loosely fisted under her chin. The lime green of her skin had gone dark in the firelight, almost the color of old oak leaves. She looked peaceful in a way she never quite managed when she was awake. Zira looked back at the ceiling. The cave was warm. The fire was steady. The seeds were in their packets, waiting for soil that wasn't ready yet. She closed her eyes. Amending the soil took 3 days. The native earth was cold, compacted, dense, useful for holding heat, but nearly impermeable to roots without work. They moved limestone grit chipped from the cave walls with the axe, organic matter from the ravine floor, ash from their fire mixed with water to moderate the balance. Kova worked the soil with her hands mostly, pressing and turning the amendments in layers with the focused patience of someone who understood that hurrying this particular process would make it longer, not shorter. My hands are going to look like an old woman's hands by spring, she said on the 2nd day. They already look like a working woman's hands, Zira said from behind the axe. That's not the same thing. In every useful way it is. Kova flicked a piece of limestone grit at her. Zira ducked without looking up. They planted the winter rye first, close enough to the warmest section of wall to take advantage of the geothermal gradient. The turnip went in the cooler outer rows. The squash they held back. Squash needed more space and more established soil. The cave moss they planted last, in a shallow trough at the base of the warmest wall. Their mother had written in her notebook that cave moss didn't need much of anything. That it was, above all else, persistent. She had underlined the word. That was unusual for her. And they talked. More than they'd talked in years, perhaps, years in Ashvale Hollow, where they'd learned to be careful. Here there were no obstacles except the ones the cave presented, and those were physical and therefore honest. She would have loved this, Kova said one evening, watching the fire. She'd have been furious about the soil quality, Zira said. Kova laughed, real this time, full and unguarded. You're right. She'd have spent the first week writing complaints about the alkaline balance in that notebook of hers. And then she'd have fixed it. Kova agreed. She was quiet for a moment. I think she was afraid of Durg, not for herself. Afraid of what he would decide to do with us if she was gone. A pause. I wonder if she knew. Zira looked at the fire. The coals were old, banked down, doing the slow, patient work of maintained heat. She prepared us, she said. The notebooks, the survey, the cave moss seeds. I think she knew something. Neither of them said anything else for a long while. On the 18th day, the first green shoot came up through the cave soil. It was a rye seedling, pale and thin from the limited light, leaning sideways toward the faint brightness of the cave entrance, but living. Genuinely living in ground that by any reasonable calculation should not have supported it. Kova found it first in the morning and called Zira over without saying what she'd found. Just come here. Zira came. She crouched down beside the plot and looked at the seedling for a long time without speaking. It was the size of her thumbnail. It was the most important thing she had ever seen. Adjust the reflector, she said. Her voice was not quite steady. They'd rigged a piece of polished tin from the pack liner against the cave wall to direct the light from the entrance toward the growing plot. Angle it another 10 degrees. It needs more. I know, Kova said. She was already moving. Outside, the blizzard that had been gathering for 3 days broke over the mountain in full. The wind hit the ravine walls and screamed over them and drove the snow into drifts that would reach the second branches of the ironwood by morning. The cold locked down everything that could be locked. Inside the cave, one small rye seedling leaned toward its light. The sisters worked on. If you're still here, don't go anywhere. What happens next changes everything. Hit follow so you don't miss it. The rye seedling did not die. Zira refused to call this a miracle. She called it a confirmation of the geothermal gradient hypothesis. Kova told her that calling it accurate didn't make it any less extraordinary. Zira said that extraordinary and miraculous were not the same thing. Kova said she was impossible. Zira said she was precise. That was how most of their conversations went when things were going well. 3 more seedlings appeared in the 48 hours after the first, pale and purposeful, and leaning toward the polished tin reflector with the single-minded determination of things that intended to exist. Kova adjusted the reflector twice a day without being asked, just as a thing that needed doing that she had assigned herself. By what Zira calculated as the 5th week, the rye had reached 2 inches. 2 inches was not a harvest. 2 inches was barely a proof of concept. But Zira measured it on a morning when the temperature outside had dropped to the kind of cold that made sound itself seem to compress, when the ravine was sealed under 4 feet of packed snow. She measured it, made a mark in the notebook, and sat back on her heels on the warm cave floor and let herself feel, very briefly, the full weight of what it meant. They were going to make it through winter, she wrote in the notebook. Not calculations this time. Words, week 5. Rye at 2 inches. Turnip seedlings emerging in rows 3 and 4. Moss established along north wall. Kova's snare line yielded 6 rabbits this week. We are not going to die here. I want to write that again. We are not going to die here. She didn't write it again. She closed the notebook and went to help Kova with the morning's catch. The squash went into the secondary chamber on day 41. A full 6 weeks of amendment and slow cultivation had transformed the clay-heavy dead earth into something that gave slightly under her palm, that smelled the way soil was supposed to smell. Kova planted the seeds in hills, 4 hills in a pattern that used the chamber's floor space without crowding the rye borders. She patted the last hill smooth and sat back on her heels and looked at the column of midday light coming down through the fissure overhead. That's everything, she said. Everything we have, Zira said. Is that frightening or comforting? Zira thought about it. Neither. It's just true. She looked at the 4 hills. We planted everything we had the day we left, too. We just didn't know the ground yet. Kova looked at her sideways. That's almost poetic. Don't tell anyone. Who would I tell? We're the only orcs on this mountain. She said it lightly, the way she said most things, but it settled into the air differently than it would have a month ago. A month ago it would have felt like a statement of danger. Now it felt like a statement of fact. And the fact had texture to it. Not quite loneliness. Not quite freedom. Something that sat between the two and didn't resolve cleanly into either. They were the only orcs on this mountain. And the mountain had turned out to be enough. By the end of the 10th week, there were 11 squash of harvestable size sitting on the secondary chamber floor. Kova looked at them for a long moment. Then, she looked at Zira with an expression that was, for Kova, about as close to joy as her face generally permitted. 11, she said, plus whatever comes in the next 2 weeks before the growth slows. We can't eat 11 squash. No, we cannot. A silence. We need someone to carry them, Kova said. It was on day 47 that Kova first heard something in the ravine that wasn't wind or animal. She had gone out to check the snare line when she heard it. Footsteps. Orc footsteps. The distinct compression and creak of a person's weight on packed snow coming from above the ravine rim. She did not move for 3 full seconds. Then, she was on her feet, moving back toward the cave. She put her head through the slot. Someone's outside. Zira looked up from the notebook. An orc? Definitely. Moving along the rim. They haven't found the slot yet. Zira was on her feet. She picked up the field knife, not as a weapon exactly, but as something that focused thinking. Then, she set it back down. Let's go see. Kova looked at her. You want to go meet them? I want to see them before they find the entrance on their own. At least if we go out, we're choosing the moment. They came out of the slot together, which was exactly the kind of thing that had always unsettled the Ashvale clan. The two of them appearing simultaneously from the same direction, moving at the same pace, with the same expression, cautious and direct and entirely not welcoming. The figure on the ravine rim above them stopped. He was younger than they'd expected from the heavy footfall, maybe 22 or 23, and lean in the way that orcs got lean after weeks in deep snow. His skin was a deep forest green, dark and weathered. Good winter gear. A hunting bow slung across his back. Both hands visible. That last part Zira noted and credited. He looked at them for a moment. You're alive, he said. The way you say something you'd already decided you believed, but weren't fully certain of until this exact second. Clearly, Kova said. Most orcs figured you were dead after the first week of that storm. Most orcs were wrong, Zira said. Who are you? He seemed to need a moment to organize himself. Raw surprise, the kind that happens when reality lands differently from the expectation you've been carrying. Verk Ashbone. I run the Upper Northwest hunting circuit. Have for 3 seasons. A pause. I'm not from Ashvale Hollow. He stopped. You just what? Kova said. I heard what they did. His jaw shifted. The whole story came out in pieces. I was angry about it. I kept thinking about it while I was running my circuit. He looked at the ravine, then at the cave slot behind them, then back at them. I didn't really expect to find you. I just didn't want to go back to my shelter without looking. Zira looked at him for a long time, a habit she'd learned to modulate in the hollow because it made orcs nervous. She didn't modulate it now. He held her look without flinching. That was something. Verk Ashboni, she said, how is the town? His expression shifted. Something behind it went harder and quieter. Bad, he said. It's bad. She looked at Kova. Kova looked back at her. Come in out of the cold, Zira said. We'll make broth. He blinked. You have. There's a cave. Come in. He came down the ravine wall carefully, testing his footholds, and they led him through the entrance slot and into the warmth. He stopped inside the entrance and stood very still. Zira watched him take it in. The fire, the shelter structure, the growing plots, the 2 inches of rye visible even from the entrance, the stone-lined water channel, the tool wall with the axe and the knife and the rope hung on their hooks, the cave moss spreading in a dark green line along the north wall. All of it. and she watched his face do something she recognized, because she had felt it herself on day 18, standing over the first rye seedling. That particular expression, not quite disbelief, not quite wonder, of an orc whose picture of what was possible has just been quietly revised without their permission. He said nothing for a long time. "You built all this?" he said finally. "We had time," Kova said, "and put water on for broth." He sat across the fire from them and drank. It was rabbit broth now, not bone water, and Kova had started adding young rye shoots to it, and told them what he knew about Ashvale Hollow. The grain stores were lower than the council had admitted publicly. 2 older families had lost elders to the cold. The hunting had been poor all season. He said Dirk Vale had not spoken publicly about his nieces since they left, not to defend himself and not to explain. He just didn't speak of them, which the clan seemed content to treat as an end to the matter. Zira listened to all of it without commenting. Her face did its careful reading thing. Kova watched the fire. When he finished, the cave was quiet except for the small sounds of burning wood and the distant, diminished sound of wind. "How often do you run this circuit?" Zira asked. "Every 10 to 12 days, depending on weather. And you pass close to this ravine?" "I can. Half a mile off my main route." She looked at the growing plots. She looked at Kova, who was already looking at her. They had been having this particular conversation without words for 20 years, and they concluded it in approximately 4 seconds. "When you come through next time," Zira said, "bring empty sacks if you have them. We'll have rye to send back with you." Verk looked at her. He looked at the rye seedlings, the pale, determined, alive rye seedlings growing in cave soil in the middle of the worst winter in living memory, and something moved across his face that had no clean name. "You're going to feed the town," he said. "We're going to try," Zira said. "Come back in 10 days, bring the sacks." He looked at the rye one more time. Then he looked at her. "I'll be here in 8, he said. He was. He arrived 8 days later with 4 empty grain sacks and a small parcel of salt wrapped in oilskin that he set on the stone shelf beside the fire without comment, the way you leave something for orcs without wanting to make a production of it. He spent 2 hours helping Kova shore up the secondary chamber's eastern wall, useful with his hands in the uncomplicated way of someone who has spent years making do in remote places. When he left, Kova said, "He's all right." "He is," Zira said. He said 8 days, and he meant it. Orcs who mean what they say usually come back. That's a very small category of orcs. It is. Which is why it's worth noticing. He came back 4 more times over the following 3 weeks. The rye in the main plot reached harvest height on his 4th visit. Kova cut it with the field knife while Zira held the stems, and Verk watched from the entrance with his hands in his pockets and the particular stillness of someone witnessing something they didn't have the right words for. "How much?" he said. Zira weighed the cut stalks in her hands. "Enough for a small loaf, maybe a loaf and a quarter." She looked up at him. "Who in town is worst off?" He didn't hesitate. "The Gruel family, 4 young ones, the smallest still sick. And old Merritt Weiss." "Start there," Zira said. "Don't tell anyone where it came from. They'll figure it out eventually." "Eventually is fine. Right now, I just want the food to get there without anyone deciding they have feelings about the source before the child has eaten." He took the grain carefully, as if he understood what it had cost to grow it. The second harvest came 3 weeks later, larger, with turnips in the outer rows ready as well, fat and firm and improbably healthy-looking. Kova pulled one and bit into it. "They're actually good," she said. "You didn't think they'd be good? I thought they'd be edible." Good is better than edible. It was on day 92 that Verk arrived a day ahead of schedule, and his face had the tight, over-controlled look of someone who had been rehearsing bad news the entire walk over. Zira put down the notebook before he said a word. "What happened?" He pulled off his helm. There's sickness in town. Real sickness, something moving through the families. Started with the Breck household 3 days ago. By yesterday, 4 more families had it. Fever, mostly, some worse. Kova turned around from the wall where she'd been checking the moss. Young ones? Adults too. But yes, young ones. He sat down heavily. Dirk Vale has been going door to door with what medicine the town has left. Which isn't much. The healer, old Merritt Thorne, she's one of the sick ones. The name sat in the cave air differently from other words. What does the town have? Zira asked. Medically, used most of the willow bark in the first cold snap. There's fever herb somewhere, but nobody can remember who has it. Zira was already running through the notebook in her head, their mother's careful notes on plant medicine. The cave moss, she said. Kova turned fully around. Fever-breaking properties. It won't replace willow bark, but it'll support whatever they have. And she was already at the pack, finding the page. Dried yarrow in the seed stores. Mama packed it with the medicinal seeds. I found it in the second week and set it aside. You kept it, Verk said. I keep things that might matter. She looked at the list, then at Verk, then at Kova, and made a decision she'd been circling for weeks. You're going to have to tell them where this is coming from. All of it. She held his look. If we're sending medicine, they need to know the source. They need to know it's reliable. They need to know who made the preparation so they know the dosage isn't guesswork. Verk was quiet. There are orcs in that clan who are going to have trouble with this. I know. Do it anyway. Tell them the truth. All of it. He looked at her for a moment, that direct, assessing look that didn't flinch. Then he nodded once, stood up, and held out his hands for the prepared bundles. The reaction in Ashvale Hollow to the truth did not arrive all at once. Verk brought the account back in pieces over the following visits. The medicine had gone to the sick families first. Merritt Thorne, recovering from her own fever, had looked at the prepared cave moss compound and the dosage notes and said, according to Verk, that whoever wrote these notes knew what they were doing, and she wanted to know who. When he told her, she hadn't said much, just looked at the notes again and said, well, in a tone that apparently covered a great deal of ground. The Gruel brothers, whose opposition to the sisters had been among the loudest on that winter morning, had gone very quiet when the news reached them. The specific quiet, Verk said, of orcs who cannot figure out how to be angry about something that is keeping their children alive. And Dirk Vale had stood in the middle of the main road of Ashvale Hollow and listened to Verk tell the full story and had not said a single word the entire time. Then he had walked home. And the orcs who watched him do it said afterward that he walked like an orc, carrying something too heavy to put down and too heavy to keep holding. On day 107, Kova's voice came from the main cave, level and careful. Zira, come here. Zira came. Kova was standing at the cave entrance, just inside the slot, looking up. At the rim of the ravine stood Dirk Vale. He was alone. He was not moving with the careful route-finding gait of a hunter. He was moving the way exhausted orcs move when they have committed to a direction and are running on commitment rather than energy. He looked worse than she'd expected, not from the cold, but from the inside. His face had gone the gray-yellow of someone who had not been sleeping. He had lost weight. His brow tusks, which had always been his most expressive feature, were turned slightly inward. She had never seen them do that before. He saw them. He stopped. Neither sister moved. The three of them held that position for a moment that felt longer than it was, the two women at the cave entrance looking up. The old orc at the ravine rim looking down. All of them in the gray midwinter light with the mountain going about its ancient indifferent business around them. He started down the wall. He slipped twice on the descent and caught himself both times with his hands, and by the time he reached the ravine floor his palms were scraped and he was breathing harder than the exertion should have made him. He stopped about 6 feet away. He looked at the ravine, the slot entrance, the compressed snow floor bearing the marks of their foot traffic, the faint warmth that was perceptible even out here if you stood still and paid attention. He looked at them. "There are 3 families with young ones in fever," he said. "Merritt Thorne is better, but she's not strong enough to tend them all. We've used everything she had." "We know," Zira said. "Verk told us." He looked at her face fully, which he hadn't done since that morning in January. She let him. "I didn't come to explain myself," he said. "I know what I did. I'm not going to stand here and—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "I'm asking for the families. Not for me." The cave was warm behind them. The rye was growing. The squash sat heavy and useful on the secondary chamber floor. Zira felt all of it at her back while she looked at this orc who had packed 2 bags the night before he sent them into the worst blizzard in 30 years. And she felt the things she'd been letting sit unsorted since Verk first said his name, and she felt it clarify. Not into forgiveness exactly. Not yet, and maybe not ever in any clean sense, but into something beside the point of forgiveness, something more practical, and perhaps more honest than that. "Come inside," she said. "We'll put together what we have." He blinked. He had not expected it to be that simple. She could tell. He'd come prepared for something harder. "Come in," she said again, more gently, and stood aside to let him through the slot. He came in. He walked into the cave slowly, and the warmth took him the way warmth takes cold orcs, gradually, perceptibly, his shoulders coming down from where they had been locked up near his ears. His brow tusks, she noticed, turned slowly outward again. He looked at everything. He looked for a long time at the growing plots, the rye and the turnips, and the moss colony spreading green and purposeful along the north wall. He looked at the shelter structure, the 2 sleeping mats, the tool wall, the tin cup hanging on its hook. He looked at all of it, and Zira watched him look, and she thought, he is understanding what it cost. He is finally actually understanding it. He said nothing about what he was seeing. She didn't ask him to. "Tell me about the families," she said, and pulled out the notebook. He sat across the fire from his nieces and told them the way an orc gives a military report. Names, symptoms, duration, what had been tried and hadn't worked. Zira wrote while he talked. Kova listened without moving. 3 young ones running high fevers, 2 adults down as well, both weakened by the long winter. Zira did the arithmetic without paper. The Moss compound will cover 3 days of fever reduction for all 5 patients at full concentration. "If the fever hasn't broken by day 4, Kova said, "it's something worse than what we're thinking. And if it's something worse, the Moss compound won't be the variable that matters anyway." Durg was watching this exchange with the expression of an orc watching 2 people speak a language he almost understood. "What do you need me to do?" he said. Zira looked at him. It was the right question, the first fully right thing he'd said since he came through the entrance. "Can you carry 4 sacks, full weight, up and out of this ravine?" "Yes, distributed to the right houses inside 2 hours of leaving here?" "Verk can help. He's been running the distribution." "Good. The dosage notes go with the medicine. Merritt Thorne needs to read them, not interpret them. Read them exactly." "I'll tell her." "Tell her twice." A pause. "I'll tell her twice," he said. Kova was already at the supply stores, working quickly and without waste. The Moss compound measured into portions on a flat stone, wrapped in oilskin, each portion labeled in charcoal. She worked with the efficiency of someone who had been doing precise things with limited materials for 107 days. Durr sat and watched them work. He didn't offer to help, which was perhaps the most honest thing he did in that hour. He seemed to understand that the workflow between the sisters was calibrated to a precision a third unfamiliar hand would only interrupt. Once he started to say something and stopped. You can say it, Zira said, without looking up from the packing. A long pause. I packed those bags the night before, he said. The ones I brought to the door. I know. I figured that out on the way up the first ridge. I wanted you to know that I knew. I understood what I was doing. I'm not going to pretend I didn't understand. Zira set down the squash she was wrapping. She looked at him fully. Why are you telling me this? Because saying I'm sorry isn't enough. I know it's not enough. And I didn't want to say it and have you think I thought it was enough. The cave was quiet, except for Kova's hands moving through the supply stores. Zira held his look for a long moment. She thought about the first ridge in the blizzard and the second ridge worse than the first. She thought about 18 days waiting for a rye seedling and what that waiting had felt like in the bones. He was right that it wasn't enough. He was also right that saying so was more honest than pretending it was. I know it's not enough, she said. I'm not waiting for enough. She picked up the squash and kept wrapping. Help me carry these to the entrance. He stood up and came to help, and for the next 20 minutes they worked in the same space without speaking. It was not comfortable and not resolved, and it was not pretending to be either of those things, which was, Zira thought, the most they could honestly manage right now. And honesty was what she had. Dur left with Verk, who had arrived at the rim while they were packing. 2 orcs went out of the ravine loaded with everything the sisters could prepare, moving with the particular urgent economy of orcs who understood that what they were carrying mattered to specific named individuals, and that speed, therefore, had weight. Verk came back 7 days later. He came quickly, and his face when he came through the slot was not carrying bad news. The young ones? Zira said immediately. Fever broke in all 3. He sat down. He looked tired in the deep-down way. Merritt Thorne said the compound. She said she hadn't seen anything work that well with what was available. She wants to know where you learned it. Our mother's notes, Zira said. 14 years of her own experimentation. He nodded. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth and set it on the stone shelf beside the fire. He did it carefully, deliberately, with the manner of someone who has been entrusted with something fragile and takes the trust seriously. Durg asked me to bring this. Neither sister moved for a moment. Then Kova walked over and picked it up. She unwrapped it, and Zira watched her sister's face do something she had not seen it do in a very long time. A sudden softness, quick as a breath, there and then controlled. Kova held it out. It was a sketchbook. Small and cloth-bound and soft at the corners from years of handling. Its cover stained at the lower right with something that might have been clay. Zira knew it before she touched it. She had last seen it on the shelf beside her mother's bed 7 years ago, the morning of the burial, when Durg had been moving through the house with the purposeful numbness of an orc dealing with objects because he could not deal with what the objects meant. She had thought it was gone. She took it from Kova and held it and did not open it immediately. The cloth had faded at the spine, but the feel of it in her hands was so specific, so densely associated with her mother sitting by the window in the late afternoon light, drawing in the focused and contented silence of someone who had found the thing they did best, that holding it was like being handed a very concentrated piece of a time that was gone. She opened it. Her mother had sketched everything. Plants in early growth, root systems exposed, and carefully labeled. The mountain visible from the window in 3 different seasons. A drawing of Zira at maybe 8 years old, caught in profile reading something, her hair loose, her feet bare on the kitchen floor, rendered with the affectionate precision of someone who found the ordinary deeply interesting. Several pages of soil cross-sections, annotated in tight handwriting. A drawing of Kova asleep, very young, one hand open on the pillow. On the last used page, there was a sketch of the mountain's upper range, the northwest quadrant, the ravines, the limestone formations. Beside it, in pencil, 2 words. They'll find it. Zira stared at those words for a long time. She thought about the cave moss seeds in their paper twist. She thought about Voss's survey folded into the notebook. She thought about her mother at 7 years old, dying and somehow, in some form, still ahead of them. She closed the sketchbook. Kova was watching her. She knew, Zira said. Her voice was steady, but only because she was using the steadiness she kept in reserve for things that would otherwise be too much. She knew we'd need it. All of it. Yes, Kova said softly. She prepared us for something she hoped would never happen. Zira set the sketchbook in the pack, carefully, next to the notebook. She pressed her hand flat on the pack for a moment. Then she straightened up. What's the state of the town? She said. Past the illness? Verk leaned forward. Surviving better because the food has made a real difference to the worst-off families. There's talk about bringing the clan's remaining seed stores up here for spring planting. Not an official proposal, more like orcs talking around the edges of what they actually mean, which is that you know something they don't. And they want to know it too. Zira looked at Kova. 6 seconds of silent conversation. They'd have to do the work themselves, Zira said. We can teach the method, but we can't run a second cave operation from here. She paused. And they'd need to accept that what we tell them is based on actual assessment of the conditions, not filtered through Elder Grot deciding what sounds reasonable to him. Elder Grot has been quieter than usual, Verk said carefully. Good, he can stay quiet. She was already thinking. The upper meadow south of the hollow, limestone shelf with a partial overhang. If the soil underneath is what I think it is, it could support a cold frame operation by late spring. You'd need to do a soil assessment first, Kova said. Yes, which means someone from the hollow comes here. She looked at Verk. Tell whoever is talking to send 2 orcs up here in 5 days. Orcs who can work and will actually listen. Not the council. Working orcs. Torvek Gruul knows soil, Verk said. He farmed lowland before he came up here. Good. Him and 1 other. Tell them they're coming to learn, not to be helped. Those are different things, and I want them clear on which one this is before they arrive. He nodded. He stood, pulled on his helm. At the entrance he paused. Durg asked me something. Whether I thought you'd ever come back down to the hollow. The cave was very quiet. What did you tell him? Zira said. I told him I thought that was yours to decide. A pause. He said yes. That's what he said. Just, yes. He went out through the slot, and his footsteps faded up the ravine wall and then were gone. Zira sat by the fire for a long time after. The sketchbook was in the pack. The rye was growing in its bed. She thought about her mother's pencil. They'll find it, past tense in its certainty, written before the finding. She thought about what it meant to be prepared for by someone who loved you. The particular painful grace of it. The way it meant the love had been practical enough to look ahead and pack for a future it hoped you'd never need. She thought about going down the mountain. Not yet. There was still work, and there were still sick families, and Torvek Gruul was coming in 5 days to learn a thing that needed to be learned before the ground thawed. But she thought about it. Kova, she said. Kova, from across the fire, without looking up from the moss she was harvesting. I know what you're thinking. Spring is coming. Kova was quiet for a moment. Then, softly, yes, it is. The fire burned on. Outside, the snow was still deep, and the cold was still real, and the winter had weeks left in it yet. But the rye was growing. The squash sat on the secondary chamber floor, round and heavy and certain. The moss spread green along the north wall, persistent as their mother had said. Persistent as they had been, as they were going to keep being. Torvek Gruul arrived 5 days later with a younger orc named Pel Ashwick, who had the hands of someone who had been working ground since he was old enough to hold a tool. Torvek stopped just inside the cave entrance and did what everyone did, went still, felt the warmth, looked at the growing plots. But he did it the way a farmer looks at another farmer's field, with a specific technical attention that moved from the overall picture down to the details. He crouched down beside the main rye bed and pressed 2 fingers into the soil, drew them out, rubbed them between his fingers, and looked at it. "You amended this heavy," he said. "The native soil was clay-dense," Zira said. "High alkaline content from the limestone. 6 weeks of amendment before the rye would germinate reliably." "What did you use?" "Limestone particulate from the wall, organic matter from the ravine floor, fire ash mixed with water for pH balance." He held her look. He was a straightforward orc in his 40s with a face that showed its history clearly. "I owe you an apology," he said. He said it the way farmers say difficult things, plainly, without performance. "My family was on that street in the winter. I didn't say anything. I know. I've been trying to figure out how to live with that. Stop trying to live with it and do something useful with it instead. Not unkindly. Just directly. You're here. That's a start. Learn this. Take it back. Teach it to everyone who'll listen. That's more useful than living with it." He held her look. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "The way you say it to someone who has just said the truest thing in the room." She taught him for 2 full days. Everything, the amendment ratios, the planting depths, the reflector system, the moss cultivation, the geothermal logic, how to identify it in limestone formations. She taught it the way her mother had taught her things, without condescension, with high expectations, and with the specific generosity of someone who believed that knowledge became more valuable when it was shared, not less. When they left on the second afternoon, their packs were loaded with prepared soil amendment materials, seed starts from the rye and turnip beds, and 12 pages of notes in Zira's handwriting. Torvek paused at the entrance slot before going through. He looked back at the cave one more time, at the rye beds, and the moss wall, and the small fire, and the 2 sleeping mats, and the tin cup on its hook. All of it built with a field knife, a small axe, a length of rope, and 112 days. "My maid asked me to tell you," he said, "that the bread we got in the 2nd month was the best she'd eaten in 2 years. He went through the slot before Zira could figure out what to do with that. She stood for a moment in the warmth of the cave and let it land. This small, specific, ordinary kindness. The best bread in 2 years. Something in her chest did a thing that was not dramatic and did not need to be. Spring arrived slowly, with reversals, the way it always did in the upper mountain range. One morning Kova went out to check the snare line and came back without going to the snares at all. Just stood inside the entrance with an expression Zira hadn't seen in months. "Come outside," Kova said. She came outside. The sky above the ravine was blue, the particular deep and genuine blue that meant the season had actually decided to change this time. The blue that had warmth behind it. The ironwood above were dripping. Somewhere above the rim, a bird was making noise. A real bird, something that had come back for the season. They stood in the ravine and looked up at the sky. 138 days, Zira said. Kova tipped her head back further, looking at the blue. Her lime-green skin caught the light in a way it hadn't since autumn. Something warmer in it, something that hadn't been there in months. "We should go down," she said. Not with urgency, just as a statement of fact. "I know, not today, but soon." "I know," Kova agreed. They went down 11 days later. Not forever. The cave was the center of something now, a working agricultural system that still needed tending. They were not abandoning it. They were choosing, for the first time, to move between it and the world below. Verk walked down with them. The path down the mountain was different from the path they'd taken up it in the winter. Physically different, but different in another way too. A way that had nothing to do with the trail and everything to do with the orcs walking it, who were not the same orcs who had walked it in the other direction on a winter morning with 2 packs and 5 days of dried meat. Ashvale Hollow looked the same from the trail above and different when she walked into it. Mrs. Gruel was in her doorway when they came down the main road. She looked at Zira and Kova with an expression so direct and uncomplicated in its relief that it was almost startling. "You're all right." Not a question. A confirmation. The Gruel youngest was on her mother's hip, the small one who had been sick. She looked at Zira with the absolute frankness of very young orcs, and then hid her face in her mother's collar, then looked again. Merritt Thorne came out of her house 3 doors down. Small and sharp-eyed, and moving with the deliberate care of someone who had been ill recently. "The Cave Moss compound," she said by way of greeting. "Our mother's formulation," Zira said. "I'd like to understand the preparation properly." "When you have time." "I'll make time," Zira said. She meant it immediately and completely. Dirk Vale was at the far end of the road. He had not come forward when she arrived. He was giving her the choice. The first actively right thing in a long series of wrong ones. She walked toward him. He looked like an orc who had been inside a hard winter and a harder reckoning simultaneously, and the combination had done its work on him. His brow tusks were still. He watched her come and didn't move and didn't change his expression. She stopped in front of him. "The sketchbook got there," he said. "It did." A pause. "It was always yours. Hers, and then yours." "Yes," he looked at the ground, then back at her face. "A lot of orcs think you should be the one teaching the spring planting method. Actually teaching it." "I know that." He was quiet. She let him be quiet. "I don't know how to fix it," he said. Not asking for help, just being honest, which was something he was learning to do. "You can't fix it," she said. "You can do better with what's in front of you. That's all anyone can do with the things they've already done wrong." He looked at her. His jaw worked. "You sound like your mother." "Good," she said. She was usually right. She held his look for one more moment. Then she turned and went back up the road to where Kova was standing with Verk and Merritt Thorne, talking about the cave moss preparation in the practical, focused way of orcs who had identified a problem they intended to solve together, and she walked into that conversation and let it take her, and did not look back. They spent the rest of their lives on the mountain, not always in the cave. The cave became one node in something larger, a system of connected growing operations, a demonstration greenhouse at the hollow's edge, knowledge that settled into the valley like a long rain, slow and pervasive, changing the ground it touched. There is something that nobody talks about much when they tell stories about orcs who built something out of nothing in hard circumstances, which is that the building doesn't make the hard circumstances not have happened. The winter was still the winter. That morning was still what it was. The second ridge in the blizzard was still worse than the first. None of that gets retroactively improved by what came after. What came after was real. The teaching was real. All of it built from something actual rather than invented. But Zira Vale never stopped knowing that she would not have found the cave if she hadn't been forced toward it. She didn't spend much time on this. It was not a productive thought, and she was a productive orc, but she knew it, held it the way you hold a stone that is sharp on one side, carefully, with full awareness of what it is. What she had come to understand over years of teaching orcs who arrived with seeds and questions, and the particular look of those who needed to believe that difficult conditions could still produce something worth having was this. Being right about the possibilities does not protect you from the cost of getting there. The cost is real. It does not become unreal in hindsight, but the cost and the building are both true simultaneously, and you get to carry both of them. And what you do with the carrying is the only part that remains yours to choose. She had chosen to build. She kept choosing it every day for the rest of her life. The mountain kept its warmth in its hidden places. The rye kept growing.